welcome to the One Spatial webinar series around the FME product stack. My name's David Eagle. I'm the FME division manager at One Spatial, and in this session we're going to be covering an introduction to FME Server. So thank you for joining us, and you're using GoToWebinar, which is our online platform. You'll notice that there is a function that you can use to ask questions. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the broadcast. If there are any questions we don't manage to get to during the session, then we will follow up with you afterwards. There's myself, Dale Parkinson, and Rebecca Meager all here to help you out. But without any more ado, I'm going to get into some of the content. And as I say, thank you for joining us. Today's session is going to be focusing on FME Server. We're going to have a look at a little bit around what FME Server is and what how it fits with the general platform of FME. And we'll look a little bit at some of the architecture of the product, just so you can get an understanding of how it's different to, for example, FME Desktop. We will do a basic tour of the FME Server interface, so you can get a sort of an understanding of the look and feel, and we'll look at some of the services and some of the things that you can do with FME Server by way of a few specific examples. So that's what we're going to focus on. Very briefly, we are One Spatial. We're a spatial systems integrator. We focus on looking at and working with people's data. With FME, we're able to transform and restructure it. With our own products, we have a focus around data quality. We are a software vendor in our own right. We also resell and partner with a number of specific organizations that you can see up in the top corner of the slide there. Obviously, the focus of this session is around the partnership with Safe Software, with whom we are a platinum partner. And they obviously are the makers of the FME product stack. The FME division, One Spatial, focuses on looking after our customers who are interested in purchasing, using, being trained on FME. We will help you understand whether FME is the right toolkit for you. We have the ability to do consultancy projects and bespoke training, whether that's face-to-face, or we're also doing a lot of online delivery at the moment as well. And we have a dedicated technical support team. So if you're somebody that's dialed in who isn't already one of our customers and you want to get in touch with us and find out a bit more detail about something in particular, then just email us at fme@onespatial.com and we'll be happy to pick up the conversation with you. Anyway, getting into the detail of today's session, this is an overview of the FME technology stack, the product set. There are three main tools: FME Desktop, FME Server, and FME Cloud. FME Desktop is the authoring environment in which you build your workflows and construct your ETL, extract, transform, and load script. And then you can run it in FME Desktop, or you can publish it to FME Server or FME Cloud and run it in those environments. And they're the sort of enterprise environment. And depending on where you install it, it could be installed on-premise, or you could install it in your own private cloud, or we could provide you a managed service with FME Cloud. And just so you're completely clear, FME Server and FME Cloud, the only difference between those two products is the fact that with FME Server, you or we do the deployment for you in your environment, whereas FME Cloud, you don't have to worry about the installation and the maintenance and support of the product. We do that bit for you. So that's hosted, FME Cloud is hosted in Amazon, and we provide you with an endpoint to the service. So it's a subtle difference. We're going to be focusing around FME Server today, and we'll look at some of the examples, but many of the examples actually that you'll see today could equally be hosted on FME Cloud. This is the stack and some of the things that are important to note about the tooling. FME Desktop, as I mentioned, is the process authoring environment. It's where you build your workspace, your script. It's the image in the middle here. You have readers and writers, so inputs and outputs. You have transformers that do the data restructuring, and you move the data between the different format environments that you want to make the data available in. FME Server is the kind of tool that you would look at if you needed to take that slightly to the next level, where you needed a solution that was scalable. You needed a tool that allowed you to have a little bit of built-in resilience, so you can install it on more than one machine. So different components of FME Server can be distributed across multiple machines to mean that if there was a problem with one of the machines, you still have access to a web service and you have that robust capability. And it is very much the sort of enterprise approach to running data translation. And the main thing to bear in mind with FME Server and FME Cloud is that you also have access to a REST API. So third-party applications could call FME to do something for you. So it becomes a much more integrated solution within your wider architecture. But FME Desktop, coupled with FME Server and or FME Cloud, they're a server-client pair. So FME Server on its own is no use to you unless you have FME Desktop. So they go hand in hand. Just looking at the general sort of roles of people that would be using these environments, there are 4 main roles. And the important thing to say is that often these roles aren't necessarily split between 4 individual people. Quite often, certainly in smaller teams, one person fulfills all of the roles. So that's an important distinction to make. Just focusing over on the left-hand side for a moment, there is always going to be a power user of FME Desktop in an organization, the person who opens up Workbench and authors the process to do something. That's the FME expert, and for a number of our customers, we fulfill that role for them. So we will do some consultancy to build a process that they then deploy in their environment. You have an FME server environment over in the middle there, and generally there's going to be somebody who looks after it, makes sure that the machines are always on and that the licenses are working and that sort of thing, so the general administrator. But that person also would probably be the person who makes connections to databases you have in your organization, connects FME Server to Active Directory and administers the AD groups so that different people in the business can log into the system. And then there might be a web developer who maybe builds a front end that integrates a service into your own intranet or your internet website. So those are some of the more administrative and developmental roles, and again, depending on the route you go, depends on how detailed those 2 roles need to get. And then ultimately, there's going to be a user, and one of the primary use cases for FME Server is to be able to provide a self-service tool. Where instead of contacting someone regularly and asking them to do a data cutout of data for you, or provide you with a filtered data set in a format that's not your usual standard, you can actually go to a website or an intranet page and go and select, filter, and download the data yourself through a managed interface. And they're the users, and your client could be a web page, or it could be Google Earth, or it could be FME Desktop, or it could be a third-party tool that is being used. So there's some of the roles, and I'm not going to get into too much detail of the architecture, but I did just want to highlight that because in an overview session, it's useful to understand a little bit about how FME Server is set up. You do have something called a core, and effectively you can refer to that as the brain of FME Server. That is the main component that manages all of the components that sit together. The bit that that is doing the hard work is something called an engine. And when you buy FME Server, you buy it with a number of engines, and that's the only pricing stipulation you need to concern yourself really with, is how many jobs are you likely to have and how long are they going to last. And once you know loosely the answer to those two questions, that allows you to size your capacity, and that also helps you understand the kind of hardware you might require to install the software on. But an engine typically will run one job at a time, and ideally you need a CPU available on the machine to be available to run your process on. So they're sort of some simple stipulations to be aware of when you're sizing your environment. But outside of FME Server, you have this, your security layer. So FME Server has got an API, and as long as you can reach FME Server within your environment, you can leverage that using other tools that you may have to request jobs to be run. And we're going to get into the interface so you can see a little bit about how you can set up scheduling and that kind of thing. But the main difference, if you are an FME desktop user already, the main thing you'll begin to realize is that one of the differences between FME desktop and server is that when you run a workspace in FME desktop, you start it and you physically push a button and run it, and the engine starts up. It does some data processing. Maybe it's taking a folder full of Excel spreadsheets and loading them into SQL Server. But you've physically run that process, and it started the FME desktop engine to run a job, and at the end it stops. The difference with FME Server is that the engines in FME Server are constantly running, and they're always listening for a job. So you don't have the overhead of a startup and a shutdown of the process, and you also have the benefit of some added services. So something that people are often very interested in is services in FME Server to do directory watching. So keeping your eye on a folder for activity. Is a file being added to a folder? Is it being deleted from a folder? Or has a file been modified? And if that has happened, FME Server spots that that's happened and goes and runs a job. So an example might be a new file is added to a directory on your network server, and FME Server is monitoring that folder for new files arriving, and when they arrive it goes and processes them, does some checking of the data, and then loads the data into a database. When we talk about scaling with FME Server, you just need to add more engines. Now that might mean that you've had to look at the deployment, the size of the machine or machines that you're using, and have a bit of forethought into that. But these days people are often using virtual machines, and scaling hardware is relatively easy. But it's some of the considerations to be aware of. In terms of FME Server, just to have a look at the physical sort of environment that you might be used to using. Often people, when they start off using products from the FME tech stack, start with FME desktop, run jobs on desktop machines or laptops. They're not necessarily scaled, set up to be the most performant data processing machines. And in some cases, if you're trying to multitask, FME can, it likes resources, so it's going to take resources for your data processing, which means that if you had to launch ArcGIS or a GIS system, or you needed to go and do a database query or use another tool that uses resources on your machine, you may find that there's a competition. In this scenario, there are 3 people running a workspace on their machines. One of them at the bottom there has got a faster machine, so gets the job done more quickly, and the other 2 have to wait a little bit longer. In an ideal world, though, what they would actually be doing is authoring the process on FME desktop and then publishing it to FME Server, where it is scheduled or triggered on that machine. That then is a more robust environment that is backed up and is monitored by your own IT people, and hopefully there's some resilience in there as well, so that should the worst happen, those machines can be brought back in an SLA time that you've agreed with your IT supplier. The benefit of having the processes on an FME on a server environment is that now there is the potential to bring in a lot of other users who may want to access data. So, for example, where previously you would be running a job on FME Desktop to extract some data from a database and put it into a spreadsheet for an end user. Now they have got a managed interface into which they can log in. They can go and specify some predefined filters that you've set up for them on a simple web page, and hit download and get access to the data that perhaps is sitting in Oracle, but you've used FME Server as the sort of data sentry that allows access to only the parts of the data that you want to make available. So any data redaction is handled behind the scenes in your FME workspace. So that's also a consideration to be aware of. And if it turns out that the end users over on the right hand side of that slide would actually like the data to be provided to them in DWG, MicroStation DGN, and they also want a map info table, and they want a CSV and an Excel, and prior to now you'd only given them access to the spatial formats. You can just re-download the workspace, go and add in a CSV and an Excel writer, and then republish the process, and now they've got access to 2 extra formats. Because if you have used FME for a little while or done any research into that product, you'll know that FME has got the ability to read and write data from around about 500 different formats. So in the market place, FME is unrivaled in its format support, and that is both spatial and non-spatial formats. The FME Server product doesn't have any specific licensing tools that you need to worry about deploying. So sometimes we get asked if there's anything else that needs to be deployed or managed within your corporate system. That's not the case. FME Server has its own licensing component built into it, so that gets deployed when you deploy FME Server. And as I said, it doesn't matter where you put FME Server. Your pricing is based on the number of engines you've got, not the hardware you're putting it on. So if you want to deploy it on Linux or on Windows, that doesn't matter. If you've got a power machine that's got lots of cores, the price doesn't change. So that's an important distinction that is sometimes the case with different products. As I said, that they're a server client pair. You build your process in desktop, you publish it to server and cloud. You can run it in desktop as well if you wish, and you have the ability in FME Workbench, which is the main sort of authoring tool, to publish workspaces up to your FME server environment and pull them back. So you can also use it as a managed process repository, because FME Server includes version control support, so for repositories like Git, for example, so you can make commits when you publish to FME Server. And if you want to go and have a look at safe.com/formats, that's a useful website to go and browse, because you'll see all of the formats that FME supports listed on that page, and they are set up so that you can see whether you can read, write, or read and write those formats. You'll also see on that page that there is reference to these additions. So the additions are only really relevant to FME Desktop. We sometimes get asked, can FME Server write this format? Well, the answer is, if you can do it with FME Desktop, with the version of FME Desktop that you've got, then when you build your workspace in FME Desktop, whatever you put into it, whatever readers and writers, whatever formats you put into that workspace, when you publish it to server, FME Server can read and write whatever is in that workspace, whatever it's being told to do. So just bear that in mind. If you need a conversation around the sort of formats that you care about in your organization, we can help you work out which edition of FME Desktop you might need, and if there's any special considerations about any third-party tools that you need to install. So I'm going to now take you over and give you a little whistle-stop tour of an FME Server environment. This is FME Server 2020, so it's the latest iteration of FME Server. And you can see that I've got a number of sort of dashboard elements to it. So it shows me last published jobs. It gives me an indication of some automations that we've been building. It shows you some favorite workspaces that you may have registered. All of the documentation is available here along with the API. You can see that I'm logged in, so I have an administrator account to this instance, and I can come in and see things that different users have got. There's a user management area here, so your administrator is generally going to have access to this this lower section to look after the FME server instance. So that's an important distinction. When you log into FME Server, there are different roles that you can have access to. You can see, for example, one of the first things you would be doing is going in and setting up your license. And you can see in here that we've got an engine availability. We've got 4 engines that are started and waiting for something to happen, waiting on this machine. And you can also see that there's a concept of queues. And if you look at this, you can see that there are several engines allocated to this queue, and it's got a priority. And that means that if you wanted to, you can come in and you can create multiple queues, and you can send certain jobs to certain queues, which means that if you are working with multiple departments in your organization and you've all got different budgets and you're sharing an FME server environment, but somebody is paying for some allocation, for some capacity, you can make sure that that department has always got access to the capacity they've paid for by using this queuing capability. So you could say engine 1 and 2 are available to department A, and that's QA, and department B get access to engines 3 and 4, and they'll never share access. But you could also have a pool queue, and that queue could have all engines allocated to it, and then if there's a little bit of capacity, then you can send a job to that queue. So it's down to your administrator to help you manage that capacity. You can see that there's a deployment status here, and the deployment status shows you that your environments on which you have capacity installed, or components of the installation. So in a high availability deployment, you might have multiple machines deployed. Now you can see I've got the ability to run a workspace, and then we've got a concept of repositories. Each repository contains some workspaces or a workspace. We'll get into running jobs in a little while. You can also see that we have something called automations. So if I go and manage automations, you can see I have a couple, and you can see in here that there is an example automation set up here, and it's an interface that is running, and you can see that effectively this is a directory watch automation. So this is an active automation that is running, that is basically monitoring a folder for activity. And if we go and have a look at this, you can see that it's monitoring for a create event. So basically, if a brand new file is created and put into a directory, then this will trigger a workspace to process that data and send an email notification on success or failure. So that's something that's going on this automation. And automations are a way of stringing together components and workspaces and notifications and actions, and in this case things like triggers that do certain things within your environment. We have a scheduling interface. Schedules, fairly obvious I think what schedules are. A task, a job that's going to happen, I can come in here and create a brand new one, and you can see I can effectively define what that's going to be. The benefit of this is that it's absolutely possible with FME Desktop to schedule jobs to run, but you need to use a third-party scheduling tool like Windows Task Manager. And that's sometimes not available to different people in the business, or you might have to have a specific IT business case to get access to use the task scheduler. FME Server has got its own inbuilt scheduling tool, so you can come in and define slots for certain jobs to run. I have a job history, so I can go and look at jobs that have been run. In recent times, I can see jobs that are sitting in a queue, and I can see jobs that are running at the moment. And you see there's no activity at the moment. There are also some dashboards that we can configure to see and understand what sort of volume of jobs are being run through the process. The important thing for the sort of job history here is we can see what activity there's been on the job. You can see the on the status that some jobs here have failed. You can dig in and work out why that is. You can see that the majority are running okay and have run successfully in the last few days. So that's important to know a little bit about what activity is going on. You've also got capabilities like apps, and I'm going to show you an app later on, but one of the new capabilities in FME Server 2020 is the ability to be able to create light apps. And the benefit there is that in a scenario where you just want to make a web page available to a number of people in the business, but you don't have, and this is the important part, you don't have that role, the web developer that we were talking about earlier on, then if you can build your process and your end user is happy with a simple app that doesn't have too much heavy customization, then actually you can do it yourself in a very short space of time. And I'll show you an app shortly so that you can see how those can be put together. But that's a very whistle-stop tour of the FME Server interface. But we will come back to that shortly. In terms of capabilities, what are the main things that you can do with FME Server? Well, automation is the key thing. I've just touched on that. The ability to have this resilient environment from which you can build scheduled jobs. We have all sorts of customers who are running scheduled tasks at different times. A number of local authorities are doing sort of COVID activities at the moment with the obvious pandemic situation at the moment. In those cases, they're running scheduled jobs to look for at-risk personnel, people in the who work for the authority, but also looking at at-risk people in the community and identifying issues by conflating data from different sources. We have organizations who are publishing open data on a schedule, and we have organizations that are managing freedom of information requests through tools like FME Server to run jobs and publish data to particular repositories on a schedule, so that it's not necessary to constantly do manual data extractions. This concept of self-service is very much around empowering people in your business to come and get data that they need themselves, but you creating an interface for them, because let's face it, not everybody is going to want to be an FME user. They're not necessarily going to want to learn a brand new tool to go and use FME Desktop, but if you can build them a simple interface to allow them to go and self-serve some data, or to do a pre-check on the quality of some of their data, then that's a possibility. Maybe what they want is just a tool that allows them to turn a MicroStation design file into an AutoCAD DWG by uploading the file and getting back the data in the new format. Maybe what they want to do is to upload a very involved, complicated spreadsheet and get back another spreadsheet, but in a more simple structure with a different tabbing structure and maybe some filtered and some checked data included in there. So there's all sorts of variations. And the last option there is around real time. So real time can mean different things to different people. It could mean that you've recently invested in a vehicle tracking system because you have a fleet of vehicles that are out on the road, and you need to connect to the third-party API, application programming interface, that's provided by that vehicle tracking company, in order to then load, say, ArcGIS Online or your own web mapping system with an up-to-date feed of where those vehicles are. That's one possibility of what we mean by real time. Another concept might be a dashboard tool. You might have a Power BI environment or a Tableau environment that you want to be constantly refreshed with new data that's coming into different databases or different systems within the business. And you want to run a job that runs very regularly and streams the data over to that dashboard in a structure that the dashboard can consume. And so it's permanently up to date. Or you may just want to provide notifications to people. So if somebody is a registered citizen with a polygon, now that might be a water supply region. If the engineer goes into the back office system and updates the status of the water supply region to suggest that there's going to be a period of outage, if there are people registered with that polygon who fall inside it in that system, they could have an automatic notification sent to them when the status of that polygon changes, so that they get told when the water is going to be switched off. And there's integrations that you can have. There's APIs and tools out there like few different systems like Twilio, for example. Twilio is an API that FME Server can interact with to allow you to send text messages and voicemails automatically. So, and obviously there's email and Twitter, and they're very standard capabilities baked into FME so that you can send notifications out to different people. These are some of the services. I'm going to gloss over this a little bit just because I just wanted to show you some of the services for those of you that are slightly more technically minded on the call. A service being a capability of FME Server and effectively what it will deliver back to you when you run a job. So probably one of the simpler ones is the one right at the top, the data download service. What that effectively means is if you author an FME process in FME Desktop that reads a CSV and writes an Excel spreadsheet, if you run it in FME Desktop, that's what's going to happen. You read a CSV and you'll get an output in a directory on your file server that gives you an Excel spreadsheet. If you publish that workspace to FME Server and register it with the data download service, what's going to happen when that job runs is that the user's going to go to a web page. They're going to look at the interface, select the input data set, and hit run, and what will happen is that the FME Server process will deliver a download in the browser, which will be a zipped spreadsheet. So it means that the input data could be in a CSV, it could be in an Oracle database, but it could be somewhere where the person requesting the data is not. So it's a very simple way of having a bit of connectivity to be able to get some data from an environment that is nowhere near the person who wants the data, but get it in a filtered and a managed way. There are some utility services. I mentioned that FME Server has a REST API. There's a token service that allows you to secure certain elements and make certain elements or apps available to different users. And I'm going to touch on a few of these capabilities through a few examples now, so that you can see a little bit of this. The terminology I'm going to start to use, there are a few acronyms in here. These ones on this slide are all genuine and real and exist. Even ZAS, which is how you can pronounce it, so that it effectively means anything as a service. We're in a time where APIs, application programming interfaces, web services, cloud-based environments are very common, and occasionally we hear terminology like SaaS, which is a software as a service, something like Office 365, using Word for Windows, but through your web browser is a SaaS solution. Infrastructure as a service is where you effectively pay somebody for a platform onto which you're going to install something. So it's generally the sort of key players there are Amazon Web Services, AWS, and then Microsoft Windows Azure, or Microsoft Azure. So you can create EC2 instances in the case of AWS and virtual machines in the case of Azure. And then there's things like platform as a service. Now that's effectively where you have a solution bundled up as a configurable environment, and Salesforce.com is a sales environment that falls into that category, and FME Cloud also falls into the PaaS category. And as I say, with this, there's going to be a few made up acronyms as follows. DaaS, actually, data as a service, is a thing. You probably have some familiarity with getting data as a service from a number of different vendors. A web service that you pay for and or not, as the case may be, and you get a stream of data into your system of choice. What it means in this context is an environment that we can go and get some data from. So if I show you a couple of these, so I've got a web browser hiding somewhere. There it is. Here's an example of an open portal, and in here, you could come in and you could say, well, I'd quite like these data sets. I want them in a particular boundary, so I might want them around the Gower Peninsula in Swansea. You can select the coordinate system and the data you want, and it delivers it in the interface that you're looking at. So it's a little bit of a front end that sits over the top of the system underneath. This is a very similar scenario. This is just a scenario for a different geographic area with a little bit of different data. Again, you can draw an extents that you might be interested in, and you use your web mapping tool of choice, and effectively you build a front end that then builds a request, and the request is effectively forming a URL as part of the REST API for FME Server behind the scenes, and it passes these parameters. So you're saying, I want this extents, I want bus routes and bus stops, I want the coordinate system that I'm interested in, which is that long, and I'd like the data in a format called Google KML. I'm going to request the data, and it sends the request to the web service, and the web service runs the job. Because that engine is running, you can see the response is very rapid, and now because it's a data download service, I can actually go and have a look. I've got a zip file, and if I go and have a look inside the zip file, let me just drag that window over, you can see that we've got access there to a zip file. If I open it up, we can see in there that we've got a KML file, which I'll just extract. If I double click on it, then in theory what's in there is a little bit of bus stop and bus route data for the small extents that I digitized that has been clipped out, and you can see that there's our links, which are the green polylines that represent the bus routes, and then these little orange pins are the bus stops or the transit stops themselves. So we've just effectively filtered the data out and provided it in the format we're interested in. So a couple of examples. There is another rather nice example, which is the state of Arkansas in the US. The only reason I'm showing a sort of an example in the US, well, partly because we've got an international audience on the webinar today, but partly because this is a nice implementation that is configured with a tool called WordPress, and what the state of Arkansas have done is effectively build in WordPress in order to have access to a basket. So you can see if I go to my cart, my shopping cart here, I've got some data that I've requested, and then I can go and proceed to download it. And then we get an interface that we might be familiar with here, because you can then say, well, of those products, I only want a county, and I only want Bradley, and I want it in a shapefile or a mapinfo tab file, or a PDF, and I want it in a particular projection, and please email it to me at the end. Now, I'm not going to make this request because I don't want to do a spurious request on a live service, but you get the idea. Because we've got the ability to deliver the data, we can either deliver it in browser as a download, or if we want to manage the user's expectations, we can give it to them as an email instead, and that will give them a web accessible link that they can get access to. TAS, or translation as a service, is effectively doing that example that I touched on earlier on, where we want to upload a data set and get back something else. So if you go onto the FME Knowledge Center, so knowledge.safe.com, a number of these examples are live examples that you can go and have a play around with today. So this is the example interface. So I could take a file. Imagine I'm a user, somebody in your business who's got a spurious file they've never seen before, and they don't know what it is. So here's a DGN file, but they're actually very used to Autodesk formats. So we could say, well, give me back an Autodesk file, but I'm going to give you a DGN. I don't know what a DGN is. I'm going to hit submit. And much like we saw earlier on, but with a slightly different interface, we've now got the ability to go and download some results. And if I go and have a look in there, we've got another zip file, and inside that zip file, we should have a DWG. So now we've got a format that the user is more familiar with, and they can go and do something with it in Autodesk as a product set. So few different variations, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of an understanding of some of the sort of on-demand services you can put in place. Validation as a service, you can build a process that does some schema checks on your data, or it does some quality checks on the content. We have a number of capabilities around data validation and error checking. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, then you can do a variety of things. So if we go and have a look at an example, I'm actually going to show you the base process in Workbench, just so you can get a feel for what's going on here. This is a relatively simple FME workspace that takes some housing stock data. So this is an Excel spreadsheet, and it's got a bit of data in it, and there's also a zip code or a postcode in here. So we're going to do a little bit of pre-validation on the structure of a UK postcode using this custom tool that is available in FME. We're then going to make a request to an API called postcode.io to go and get the information back of the coordinates, put the position of those postcodes. If I run this through, we'll see that will actually build some web requests, so you should be able to see those rattle by. There you go. You see those little URLs there with a different postcode at the end of each of them, and lots of features. So we're making a multitude of requests to that API, and then the perhaps odd thing here is that then we're using a tool called the HTML report generator, which allows us to effectively create a web page. So we're going to get a dashboard. So if I go and look in this directory, this output directory, there is an output HTML file. So I could go and open that up, but I'm going to sort of save my thunder for a moment, because I want to go and show you that exact process run on FME Server. Because if we run it on FME Server, because it's a streamable format, the impact is that we'll actually get it to automatically open up in the browser window. So if I go into this validate process, make sure it runs as a streaming service, we can run this process in the FME Server interface. So you could build a little app that allows a user to just go and hit run. They upload a spreadsheet and then hit run, and actually it gives them back a report straight away. And here's the report directly in the interface. So it shows them the valid postcodes, and it's put them on a map, and you can see that I can click on them to see which ones they are. And down at the bottom it shows the ones that are not valid and have got a problem with them, and then what might be the issue. In this case, that postcode, that zip code is too short. This one is only alphabetic values included in the string, and we need alphanumeric code values. So a few different issues there with that process. And then there's things like building an app that I talked about earlier on. And I'll if you want to just those of you that are on, if you've got a tablet or a laptop or your phone handy, you're obviously watching this on some sort of device. If you go to that URL, bit.ly/bizfind, and I'll show you that in a second. So it's bit.ly/bizfind. And whilst you're doing that, I'm just going to go and have a look behind the scenes, because in FME Server, as I mentioned, you can run workspaces. There's a repository in here that we've got, and inside this repository there is a workspace called the One Spatial Business Finder. Now if I go and have a look at this workspace, you can see in the interface here that we've effectively got a process that creates something, does a little bit of geometry replacement, sets a coordinate system, and then there's a specific transformer here called the Google Places connector. Now that connects to the Google Places API, and it effectively allows you to go and find places of interest as if you were Googling them on a Google map. But we're doing this through an interface instead. So we've got a hosted workspace. Now ideally you don't really want somebody to have to log into this interface necessarily to go and run this process. You can see, for example, there's things that you can decide what you want to go and see, and you've got a little map picker here that you could say, well, I want beauty salons in Leeds, and within a 10-kilometer radius, that kind of thing. But actually it'd be much nicer if we could build our end users an app. So if I go to manage apps, you'll see that I've got an active one here, we've got a little description in here what this app does. It's a favorite workspace. It's telling us which workspace we're running, and we're running it with a streaming service. And then as a non-web developer, I can come in here and say, in this workspace, the parameters I want to make available are on the app are the choices. So the pick list, the location picker. Then I want to put a basic bit of customization in here. So the customization is going to be, what's it going to be called, what the color is of the page is, what are the logos going to look like, what's the little icon up in the browser going to look like. That's these icons that you can see up in the browser tab. And then is it going to be available publicly, or are people going to need to authenticate to log into it, and how long is it going to be available for? So you can see this app is going to be auto expiring in 16 days. So if you go to bit.ly/bizfind, you'll see that you've got access to this app, and you should be able to do that directly now. You can go and select a choice. So I'm going to go and look for a supermarket, because it's sort of 90% of my time out of the house is going to shopping. That's about it these days. I'm going to go and find a location. Well, I will go to Leeds just for fun. Because I can't go there in person, I'm going to go there. There we go. So let's go to Leeds and confirm that location, and then search radius 10 kilometers, and I'll click OK. Now there is some error trapping in here as well. So if you go and look for beauty salons in the North Sea within 10 kilometers, then you'll find nothing, and you'll be told that there is nothing. Here you can see supermarkets in Leeds, and we get a little dashboard with the Venus supermarket, and then there's a little listing down at the bottom here, and there's also a Google score, so their rating and the number of reviews that supermarket has had. And that's all based on the Google Places API. Things like query as a service. The reason why I wanted to touch on this is because I mentioned that you can use anything as a client of FME Server effectively. some of you may have heard of terminology called webhooks. So webhooks are where you can basically make a link available to an application. And I've just, in this case, I'm using using Excel as a client. So a simple scenario. Now, ordinarily, you wouldn't expose this URL to the end user. You'd create a hyperlink that had the name of a farm in here, and it had a hyperlink to it. But the point is, you can create a little spreadsheet, ship it to a colleague, and say, if you want to get some data for farm number 4, just click the hyperlink in the spreadsheet. And behind the scenes, that goes off and makes a request to a service. And what's happening, hopefully in my browser behind the scenes here, is that you see a little KMZ file just got downloaded. Now, if I go and click on the KMZ file, it goes and takes me over to Scotland, I think, and it gives me a point of interest, which is where that farm is located. And it's also done a search in a database behind the scenes to find out which district it's in. It's in the Scottish borders, which Parliament region, what's the nearest settlement. It's 1.8 kilometres away, and it's a place called Tranquair. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly for my Scottish friends, but there it is. So you can see the proximity. So it's a little bit of a search tool effectively, and if you go and click somewhere else, you'll go and get another KMZ file generated, and then you can click it and go and have a look at that location instead. So, effectively you've got an authenticated, and in this case token validated service that you don't need to authenticate, you don't need to log into it, you just need to supply a token with that request. And you could use an application to do that, or you could use a tool as simple as Excel to do that kind of thing. Then there's examples that just wind up the session really. Fun as a service. Just if you want to know what's possible in FME, it's always good to just go and have a bit of a hack. We can provide you with trial licenses to go and have a play around with what's possible in FME. For example, if I wanted to run a little service to go and query a comic book website. XKCD is just a great little comic service that you can go and have a look at. If you run an FME workspace against it, this site does have its own API. I can run a process that gives me a random comic, and it's powered by FME. And we get the comic back. If I go back to the service and go and rerun this, I'll get another comic delivered to me. So I'm not going to spend too much time on those because it is completely random, and who knows what's going to come back. But that's the kind of thing you can do. You can use FME to work out who's going to make the next round of tea once we get back to working in offices. If you want to work out the next lottery numbers, you can use FME to work those numbers out for you. There's all sorts of silly things that you can do, and we can, if you're interested in trial licenses to understand, the art of the possible, as I say, we can help you with that. If we look at something that hasn't got geometry associated with it, because I want to highlight that it is just as possible to use FME to process data that doesn't know anything about data. So we're just going to tidy up a little bit, and I'm going to go and show you real time as a service. So if I just go back to FME Server and go and have a look at an example in here, there is a TransLink example. This is Northern Irish example. So TransLink are the suppliers, the passenger transport suppliers, bus and rail suppliers in Northern Ireland. And they have an API for timetables. So you can see a little example here. You've just got 2 pick lists with places from and to. So you could build a little app that allows you on your commute to work out when the next train is. So if I wanted to go from Belfast Central to Bangor, if I run this process, it's going to give me a little dashboard that tells me whether I need to go and run for my train or not. And you can see in here that it's 11:55 at the moment. We're just going to wind this webinar up, and the next train is 12:10. So if I wanted to go and get that train on platform 9, that is very slightly running, and the departure at 12:12, I would probably have to run quite fast to get that train, but I've got other options. So, from a dashboarding perspective, if you've got a web page that you just wanted to update every 2 minutes, you could run a scheduled job to go and connect to that third-party API and update this web page for you with the latest values. Nice and simple little use case there. So these are some of the reasons why people go down the route of FME Server, and I wanted to touch on those at the end. Data download services, providing self-service is a very common usage. Using FME for some sort of data upload capability, so I want to upload something and get an answer back. That's a very common approach that I've touched on in this session. Notifications or trigger events, so if a database record is updated in one part of your business, you may want a stored procedure to trigger FME Server to go and take that data and synchronize it across other parts of your business. That's another example, or a trigger event might be something happening in a folder or elsewhere in your network. And then the other thing that is sometimes forgotten is actually one of the main reasons people take on board FME Server is if you've got to do some really heavy just data moving, data grinding. One of the first engagements we as an organization often have with a client is when something significant changes in their business and they need to migrate data from database A to database B, or flat files to a third-party provider in the cloud. FME can move that data for you, and you can do the schema mapping exercise to make sure that the square peg fits in the round hole, because no two data environments are the same. So there's a little bit of an overview of FME Server. I hope this has been a useful session to you. If you want to get in touch with us to find out a little bit more, please do. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for joining us today. If you go to our website, onespatial.com/FME, there's lots of contacts and there's a lot of detail about the FME product stack and what we can do to help you. Safe's website, safe.com, has got enormous amount of material as well to assist. This webinar will feature on our on-demand page, as are a number of others. So a few weeks ago we did an FME desktop introduction session, so if you want to go back and watch that session, that is live on our on-demand page right now. Other than that, if you want to do a little bit of research yourself before you get in touch with us, then the Knowledge Base, Knowledge Center is the place to go. So that's knowledge.safe.com. But other than that, thank you very much for joining us today. And there's my contact email address, david.eagle@onespatial.com. If you'd like to ask me a question, you're more than welcome. But for now, it's the end of the session. We will hang online to finish answering some of your questions that have been coming in whilst the session has been running. But other than that, lovely to have you on board, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks very much.